Hello interwebs, welcome to Let's Build Computers. Today I'm looking at the AeroCool Cylon 4 CPU RGB air cooler. So we're going to take this out of the box, have a look at what's in there, then we're going to get this fitted to a computer and see how it stacks up against a couple of other different types of coolers. I'm quite excited to look at this one because it's a low-cost air cooler with a decent focus on aesthetics as well. One of the main reasons why I tend to, and why a lot of people tend to go for more expensive coolers or AIO water coolers and things like that, is purely because they want something that looks good in the case. And cheap air coolers often let down the interior appearance of your computer. You can have a really nice case and lots of lights, but you've got a natty little stock blower sitting on your CPU, kind of ruins the vibe of the computer. So this thing should offer a really affordable solution to that issue. Let's get it out of the box and take a look. Right, at the top we've got a box of fittings. We'll have a look in there at the moment, followed by fittings instructions, and then we've got this polystyrene case with the rest of it in. That was fairly painless. Oh, this is really painless to open up. I'm liking it already. Okay, so the whole cooler comes all fully pre-assembled. The fan is pre-fitted and everything, and that's the whole unit. Let's rearrange the camera and we'll take a look at the whole thing. So looking at the cooler itself, we've got a 120mm PWM fan on the front with this RGB ring light around it, and we've got another RGB strip across the top here. These are all addressable, so you can plug these into your motherboard RGB controller or any other RGB controller that you have that's compatible with standard addressable RGB headers. We'll take a closer look at that in just a moment. The cooler itself is a 4 heat pipe design, and these heat pipes do have direct contact onto the CPU as well, which AeroCool calls their heat core touch technology. So really good design there. That means you're going to get the heat straight out of the CPU rather than having to have the heat go through a cold plate first before it gets to the heat pipes. Because when you have that cold plate technology, you then have to rely on how good the soldering is between the cold plate and the heat pipes and things like that, and it's just another layer to go through. So this design is really good. It means that you can get extremely good heat transfer with a relatively small number of heat pipes, because these days it's not uncommon to have a 6, 8 or probably even 10 heat pipe coolers now. If we move around to the fin stack itself, everything is all nice matte black, so it looks really smart in a modern design. And the fin stack on top is covered up by the plastic shroud. So a little bit of scratchy plastic going on here, but by the time this is in the computer, fitted and illuminated, that's going to look just fine. I believe that the fan is removable. We've got 2 of these cams on the bottom here. If we just rotate those around, I think we'll probably find that this can slide off. It can. There we go. So if we slide that off, we can see that we've got the RGB fan in here, and we can see the extra LEDs there that illuminate the LED strip. So that's all part of the fan. That's quite a nice design. I like that. And we can see that the top finish of the heatsink is also really nice. There's no horrible janky bits underneath. All of the heat pipes have been nicely finished, so there's no sharp edges or unfinished bits where the painting got missed. If we slide that back on, that goes on really easily. You could do that no problem. Once it's fitted to the computer, yeah, I can slide those cams on, so you could easily remove that fan for cleaning without having to remove the cooler from the computer. So that's going to be really good for maintenance. That is much easier to deal with than the standard sort of spring clips that you get on most air coolers. So I like that a lot as well. Let's take a look in this box of fittings. So now in the box of fittings, we've got various hold downs. We've got LGA 2011 for the old HEDT stuff. We've got standard Intel fittings for socket 775 up to the 115X series, so 1155, 1156 and so on. We've got AMD brackets here, which will be compatible with AM4 and upwards. We've got the RGB cable, and then we've got the rear bracket here, which is universal for AMD or Intel boards, as well as a little packet of thermal grease as well. So let's get this thing fitted into a computer. I'll show you how it fits into the motherboard, and then we'll do some thermal tests on it as well. The instruction pamphlet is nice and clear with Intel instructions on one side and AMD instructions on the other, so no confusion there, no having to hunt through a big old poster looking for which bit applies to you. We've got a nice clear indication on what's in the box and what each part is, and then numbered instructions to get you fitted. So I'm going to be fitting this onto a Ryzen 3600, so we're on the right side of this page already. Let's go through it all. So I'll start at number 2 to get the cooler ready, because I'm going to do this bit in a moment. So we've got to remove the fan from the cooler. Put that to one side. Then we need to prepare the back plate with the correct AMD fitting. So let's take this all out. Okay, so now we're going to put these little screw points into our back plate, and there's very faintly marked there. It says AM3 and AM4. So we want to make sure that those screw points line up with the correct slots. I'm installing with an AM4 socket, so we're going to go for those. And we lock those in place with these plastic tabs. There we go, and that's now ready for use. Okay, number 4, now we've got to bolt the AMD brackets onto the bottom of the heatsink. And we need the J screws for that. Okay, there's my AMD fittings fitted onto the heatsink. What's next? So next we're going to bolt those through onto the back plate. Right, so the motherboard I'm fitting this to is a Asus X470F Gaming Strix, or Strix Gaming, whichever way around it is. And I've got a Ryzen 3600 fitted to this fella. I've already removed the stock AMD cooler and all of the stock AM4 hold down plates. So we've just got empty holes there that we can mount this up to. So I'm going to position the back plate behind it there, just so these screws are poking through. So while the Cylon 4 does come with a single sachet of AeroCool thermal paste, I'm going to be using Arctic MX4 for my installation, purely for the reason that I'm going to be testing this cooler versus other coolers, and I want to use the same thermal paste on all tests for fairness. However, the supplied thermal paste will be perfectly good for a one-time installation, so don't worry about buying a separate tube. However, if you're in the habit of maintaining your computer often, it's really handy to have your own tube of thermal paste anyway. So I leave the choice up to you. And before I put the heatsink on properly, obviously we're going to take off the sticker from the bottom of it. And I'm going to double check that all of these screws are in their correct position. For an AM4 installation, I need to make sure that the screws are on the internal position of these lugs. And that will ensure that they line up with the holes. So I'll position the near side corner. Then we'll just gently guide all the other screws into position. Okay, I've got all of my screws lined up, so now I'm going to get a big ass screwdriver and start turning those in. Just put a couple of turns into each screw just to make sure that you're actually oriented onto the hold down plate. You don't need to push down at this point, just turn the screws so the threads start biting up. And now we're just going to go around the heatsink many times and just turn those in. There we go, and that is now mounted up. So I didn't need to use any push down force at all. That was really nice. There was no having to hold everything in place while I put my elbow into it, which is always nasty when you're fitting a CPU cooler and you're having to press down on those springs. None of that was required here. All I had to do was just turn those screws down to the stops. We don't need to tighten them up at all. Just turn them down to the biting point where they stop turning, and that's it. Leave it alone. These big springs here, those are doing all of the legwork for us. We don't need to do any over tightening. And that means that this thing will be really easy to remove for later maintenance, or if we're doing any kind of upgrades as well. So now I'm just going to give it just a little bit of a wiggle, just to make sure it's seated on the CPU properly and to make sure the thermal paste has settled properly. And now we're ready to fit the fan. And now this will just slide down on top of the heatsink. And I should just be able to put my fingers underneath and turn those cams back into place. There's one, and there's the other. If I just turn that, you should be able to see, there we go, there's the cams there. So those just spin through 90 degrees on the spot. And that is now fitted. So I'll tidy these cables once they're into the computer, but we've got a PWM fan header there that's just going to go straight onto the CPU fan header on the motherboard, and then our RGB fan header. This guy can go off to one of the RGB headers on my motherboard. I've got one down the bottom of my motherboard that I can connect it to. However, I've got an AeroCool case that I'm going to be dropping this whole lot into that has a built-in RGB controller, so I'm going to connect it to there instead. And that's our cooler successfully fitted. These Patriot Viper memory modules that I've got fitted to this board are 40mm tall from the bottom of the pins to the top of the fins, and they are about 8mm thick. So you can see from this one fitted into slot 1, there's no clearance issues there. If they were taller, they would still clear the fan in slot 1. So if you're running tall around because it's RGB or something like that, you'll still be fine as long as your memory isn't going to go, if it starts straying into about 10mm thick, I think you might start having 10mm thick and 50mm tall, you might start having clearance issues in your first slot. However, for any general use memory modules, no issues whatsoever. And then if you're going to run a 2 memory module configuration, as most general users would be doing so with 2 8GB modules, obviously you've got no problems at all with pretty much any kind of memory module. For my first test, I've done a basic Intel burn test with another 2 coolers. I've got the Wraith Stealth cooler that comes with my Ryzen 3600 as a baseline, and I've got a Corsair H100i for a higher end comparison. I'm running the fans on the same standard noise curve so we can see how the coolers behave out of the box, so to speak. The test was run for about half an hour at a time, and it moves in cycles, so the core temp will bounce up and down, as you can see. However, this is an all-core load that represents a fairly unrealistic level of stress, so it's a worst-case scenario. Starting with the AMD Wraith Stealth at 81 degrees centigrade, we can see that the small heatsink and low thermal mass hurts this cooler a lot. It starts off rough and then it quickly gets worse as the heatsink is overwhelmed. This cooler can cope with regular use, but it's well out of its comfort zone in this particular test. The Cylon 4 sits at a much more respectable 66 degrees. The 4 direct contact heat pipes wick the heat off of the CPU much quicker, and it keeps it spread out over the entire fin stack. Bigger CPUs like a 3800X are probably going to tax this cooler a lot harder, but at that point you should be fitting a bigger thermal solution anyway. For its price tag, the Cylon 4 is offering a huge temperature drop over the box cooler. The H100i can't really stretch its legs on a smaller CPU like the 3600, it's only sitting 5 degrees lower, but it could probably keep this chip in check with the fans unplugged as well. This comparison serves to show that aside from pimp value and aesthetics, a larger cooler like this is just overkill for a mid-range or lower CPU. Setting the fans to maximum speed doesn't change the picture much at all. With the Ryzen 3600, the cooler's main job is just absorbing the heat rather than dissipating it. But this also means that you can stick the Cylon 4 on a silence fan profile and it won't make any meaningful difference to its performance, so you can enjoy the silence. The Wraith Stealth is running at max speed already, so it scores basically the same temperature within a margin of error. With regards to noise, the coolers go all in size order. The Wraith stealth is actually fairly quiet even at full tilt, despite being at its limit all the time. The H100i is very loud due to its dual static pressure fans, but under normal circumstances it would never spool them up anyway. The Cylon 4 sits between them as expected. It's virtually silent at idle, and while you can hear it wind up under full load, the 120mm airflow fan on it is more than acceptable. The sound's more of a low-pitched hum rather than the high-pitched whine that you'll get from the Wraith series of coolers and their 100mm fans, or the tornado of a water cooler at full tilt. Onto the cost. At the time of the review, the Cylon 4 is £32 on Amazon UK. It's easily an affordable add-on for the modest build that'll drop your temperatures from stock and add a nice centerpiece flair to your PC. It's a perfect pair up with either an AeroCool RGB case like the Eclipse, or other cases that support addressable RGB. Or of course you can also connect it directly to an ARGB header on your motherboard. Big thanks to AeroCool for sending one over to me. I can certainly recommend it for budget and mid-range builds. If you liked this cooler, also check out our recent review of the Aero 1 Eclipse, a perfect partner case for this cooler. Thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you all next time. Bye for now.